Well, my name is Tom Bearden. I'm a retired lieutenant colonel. Presently also rather suddenly retired from aerospace with the aerospace step down widespread throughout the country. I've been doing research for many years into several areas, one on some of the work of Nikola Tesla, one on the area of trying to produce both a theory and some practical results for over-unity electrical machines, a small amount of work in anti-gravity, and then some medical applications, primarily in a new kind of electromagnetics. I once said Tesla was a dichotomy. Certainly, Tesla had certain idiosyncrasies which have been played up, usually any creative genius does. If you accept those and don't dwell on those, Tesla was a magnificent genius, in my opinion. I think he was so far ahead of his time in what he could do and what he understood, not necessarily in the language and the phraseology we use today, but in his own language and his own phraseology. I think he was well ahead of the times, 100 years ahead of his times, and maybe in this conversation we'll even go into that.
If Nikola Tesla, is what you said he is, why is he so relatively unknown to the general public?
Through a whole series of events. Tesla in his life story admitted one time he had been a gambler and then he quit because he was a compulsive gambler. The last great gamble that Tesla took, he lost. And that, of course, was his great installation on Long Island, Wardenclyffe. He had, at that time, put everything he had into, you might say, one kettle. It was funded by Morgan. There was some struggle between Morgan and another financier who were in a great struggle with each other. It affected the stock market. It created inflation and everything. Plus, Tesla had done a very strange thing. As a gambler, he knew that Morgan would never give him his $150,000 that he needed to do the installation that he really wanted to do, which was going to cost more than that by some amount. So he had designed a smaller installation of 2 transmitters when he briefed Morgan, and he briefed him only on the communications aspect of it. Tesla had foreseen, as many people had at that time, but he had clearly foreseen the broadcast industry sending pictures and sound and music and so forth and information through the air. So Morgan financed the $150,000 based on communications only. Morgan knew of Marconi's work and some others who were racing to try to be the first wireless, as they called it in those days. Morgan was, he didn't care about all the finesse and so forth. He was strictly a financier. He was strictly interested in making money. And he knew this new area was going to go and going to make money, a lot of money, for whoever got there first. And in his opinion, Tesla had the best chance to get there first. So that's why he backed Tesla. Tesla, however, was even more interested in doing a worldwide energy system to provide energy that would be very cheap for everybody in the world, anywhere on the earth. And so the actual installation that he started building was this giant installation so well known to the Tesla fans and people who read of Tesla. In the struggle between Morgan and his counterpart almost bought Morgan's railroad company right out from under him. He bought, in fact, control of the voting shares of the preferred stock, but not of the common stock. And Morgan issued orders from Europe to buy all the stock that could be bought at any cost. In one day, the stock made astronomical jumps. The whole stock market went crazy. We don't have anything like that in our time. Inflation became suddenly rampant. Parts and electrical things went up 3 times, for example. And suddenly everybody furnishing parts, there was a panic because of the money shortage and everything, and the stock, we would today call it a crash in other stocks. So what happened is they began demanding all their money up front to the very beginning.
Are you saying that Tesla was forgotten after Wardenclyffe, that it was Wardenclyffe that ruined his reputation?
Well, it was a combination of events. There were many people who resented Tesla, particularly among the academic community. Number one, they didn't understand at all how he worked. He didn't have the academic credentials, what they regarded the high academic credentials they had. He, of course, had academic credentials. He certainly had been very vocal that the common electromagnetic theory, which he usually referred to as the Hertz theory and the Hertz waves, since Hertz, proved the Maxwell predicted wave. Tesla was adamant that there were no transverse Maxwell-Hertz waves in the ether, and that Tesla, was not using that kind of theory at all. That theory was very limited and did not apply to what he was doing. In other words, what he was saying to the entire scientific mind of the day was that what you're doing, gentlemen, is erroneous. Not only that, I'm proving you're in error. But because he had become a household word, when you do, you become a single name, Tesla, not Nikola Tesla, you see. And because of this kind of effect, he had become essentially the great wizard. He had given us the AC power system and everything, and there was a great deal of resentment for what they regarded as an upstart inventor who was, in fact, essentially saying, I'm going to usurp your science. They would interpret it that way. Not all people were detractors, but many were. He also was not a great theoretician. He didn't fill up books with great theories and full of mathematics. And so he just didn't practice the game as it was being practiced. He was ostracized, I think, primarily because of his difference and because of his radical statements and because of his pronouncements of great systems. They didn't have the foggiest notion of what he was talking about. He had one other unfortunate incident, which today we would laugh at, but was very serious at the time. I think it was 1901. I'd have to check my records. He picked up radio signals from space. We know today, of course, that planets radiate RF noise and so forth. But when he announced this, it just caused a sensation, and all the scientists said immediately, what a kook, what a idiot. So an unfortunate reaction occurred in the scientific community that he had to be an utter kook because everybody knew that there were no signals from space. And that was an unfortunate timing and contributed to his demise.
Nikola Tesla also had an ego.
Very big.
And there's some argument for the fact that his ego, or his vision of self, may have undone him as well. Could you address that?
Yes, that's quite true. He was arrogant. He knew in his mind what he had done and what he could do. He had done the experiments, for example, in his few months at Colorado Springs, which proved that he was on the right path, and he was hastening back to New York to get the funding from Morgan and set up his Wardenclyffe and get on with doing the wireless, but also the other energy at the same time. He was going to do it all in one stroke. And when this panic came along and supplies went up, and finally he made the final fatal mistake. He briefed Morgan in desperation that what he was really about, because he thought Morgan would appreciate that. He simply did not understand a financier who's not interested in all of that, but what is it going to do to make me money? There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying that's the way Morgan approached it. At that point, Morgan also knew that Marconi was closing in on it and very close to transmitting wireless across the ocean, the Atlantic. So Morgan knew at that point, briefed on what yet had to be done and how much money Tesla needed and all that, he knew the game was lost from a communication viewpoint, that Marconi was going to be first. So at that point, Morgan, in his own mind, wrote it off as a bad investment gone sour. And one thing he did not do was throw good money after bad. A perfectly sound business decision today, we would say. So he simply wrote the project off. Tesla could never understand for some months thereafter what had happened, why he couldn't get the extra money. People began to quit work because he couldn't pay them. The suppliers wouldn't send him his supplies because he couldn't pay them up front. And the whole thing began to sort of grind to a halt. He did get the installation in operation, but he never succeeded at what he was doing. And by that time, Morgan was never going to finance him again. A combination of events then occurred within a few years of that to where suddenly things began to shift. The jealousy of the scientific community began to suggest that he was, after all, just a kook. Everybody knew that thing on Wardenclyffe was foolish. And so he became almost a non-person in the space of a very few years. Older man living in a hotel room, feeding the pigeons. with all his idiosyncrasies. He really did have idiosyncrasies. He had a morbid fear of germs. He would use something like 17 white napkins for a meal that he would have, and meticulously lay one aside once he made the first wipe with it to wipe his hands or whatever. He had a lot of idiosyncrasies, and of course his autocratic pronouncements, as you say, his ego also was there. He also had quite an ego, and so people just shuttled him aside and said, well, he's at best an egomaniac who's mistaken, and at worst he's just a lunatic. I mean, they simply wrote out of the books what he had done. I focused in on the electromagnetics because early on in my work I also became disenchanted with the present electromagnetics model. To understand Tesla, you must take seriously, I think, his suggestion that the present electromagnetics model is seriously flawed. Nobody wants to take that seriously. Most of the people who approach Tesla use the conventional electromagnetics, and when they cannot explain what he was talking about, they say, therefore, the man was a kook. Now, suppose for a moment that he really was correct. Suppose there is something wrong with the classical electromagnetics. Of course, you can use the classical model to do the things we do, but it means there are many other things that can be done that we cannot do because we have excluded that part from our model and from our teaching and from our knowledge and from our instruments. Let's pursue that a moment. The original electromagnetics written by Maxwell himself was written in an algebra called quaternions. What we mean here is a higher topology algebra in which you can do things in this kind of expression of electromagnetics that you can't do in vectors or tensors. Now, the real theory that Maxwell had, depending on who counts the equations and what they count, is something like 20 equations and 20 unknowns, to give some numbers to it. When Heaviside got through translating it into a much simpler algebra called vectors, which he helped create, and he wrote all the modern equations that are used as Maxwell's equations, not Maxwell himself. None of those ever appeared in anything by James Clerk Maxwell. When Heaviside modified it to a much easier algebra called vector analysis, which he helped complete the algebra itself, it consisted of some 2 equations or so with an extra equation thrown in, depending on the way you want to count that again. Certainly, if you want to count the full thing, 4 equations. So you can see a remarkable reduction in the amount of variations of things you could do. And that's what I mean when I say we previously had an electromagnetics that permitted lots of functioning that is no longer permitted by the kind of electromagnetics we're all taught to apply and use today. It's a subset of what can be done. A scientist by the name of Barrett, a very brilliant scientist, has done a very good analysis. When Hertz announced his discovery of the Maxwell waves, it's in there if you read it, but actually Tesla went to see Hertz to convince him of the error of his ways and showed him experiments and everything else to prove that the wave that was actually in the ether was not a transverse string wave, but in fact was what today we would call a longitudinal sound wave, a wave of rarefaction and compression. He did do that and was not able to convince Hertz, but Hertz was very disheartened by all this evidence that Tesla had given him, but never revealed what the evidence was. Let's look now and see if there's any room for what Tesla was saying. And I want to tell you a story of the greatest joke on all of science in all of history, because you'll never understand Tesla till you know this joke. When they were trying to write the wave equation for the plucked string wave, of course they were studying plucked stringed instruments. You have a taut string suspended between 2 points, on the body of an instrument, and they simply plucked the string various ways and watched the waves. They then wrote equations for the tensile forces and so forth in the string. They isolated the string. They assumed that there's nothing else happening but the string. And using the forces, and they still teach the sophomore students to do it this way, they derived the string-wave equation. First of all, there is no such thing as a tight string independently existing apart from a holder anywhere in the world. There never will be. There is, however, a tight string which has equal and opposite forces in the ends of the holder that's holding the string and creating the tension on the string. If you will apply the same approach and ask yourself the full question, what system was perturbed? It was not just the tight string. It was the tight string plus the body of the instrument. What comes about is that every transverse string wave that occurred in the string, an equal and opposite highly damped wave occurred down in the body of the instrument. Every guitar picker, which I'm a very poor one, knows that the body of the instrument vibrates when you pluck the string. You depend on the characteristic of that for your sound. What happened, though, by throwing away the holder and the anti-wave in the holder, every time a mathematician or a physicist writes a wave equation, he has thrown away half of the problem of the phenomena. The anti-wave still exists, but he threw it somewhere, usually into a highly damped system, and ignores it. The way he gets by with that, at the end, where he has now described his reactions with the single wave equation, the transverse wave equation, the other wave reappears, and he says, oh, that's Newton's third law reaction force, because it's always equal and opposite. Well, Newton's third law is not a law, it's a description. It is not a mechanism for what causes something at all. If you add back in the wave that is missing, guess what you get? You get equal and opposite waves in the vacuum. These waves are, in fact, longitudinal waves. They are more sound-like, and Tesla was right, and all the textbooks in the world are wrong. And now let's turn that from talking sound, let's turn it to electromagnetics. If I examine an atom and I see the complex assembly of dipoles, each dipole being the electron charge and a piece of the positive charge of the nucleus, I find something very similar to the holder and the string. That is, I have something very light, the electron, which is perturbed, and I have something which is highly damped, the very heavy nucleus, by the equal and opposite anti-disturbance. And we still know that exists, but we call it Newton's third law. We just invoke a description, have no idea what causes it. But anyway, if the wave comes in from the vacuum and is intercepted by one of these dipoles, in addition to the disturbance, the string wave that we will see off of the electron end, we will have the anti-wave, the recoil forces, on the other end. And so always we get equal and opposite. We do get the opposite wave, and what came in from the vacuum had both. The separation between the two charges caused the separation of the two waves, just as the separation between the string and the body of the instrument caused the separation of the wave and anti-wave in the plucked string instrument. So we still have the same thing, and we still hold to the fact there is a longitudinal wave in the vacuum, not just a single transverse wave. Now let us see what happens when we launch a wave, now that we know that from an antenna. When I launch a wave from a physical antenna, the matter in the antenna is made of these same atoms and these same dipoles. And in addition to launching the wave from the electron shells and the electron interactions, there is a highly damped anti-wave launched at much less disturbance, highly reduced, of the anti-wave. But as soon as it emerges from the antenna, there is no longer any damping because there's no longer any heavy nuclear mass. And so immediately it pops to full shape and full size, and so we still have the longitudinal wave in the vacuum that we launch. Can I prove that in what we receive? Yes, indeed, I can. And you must understand this if you ever understand Nikola Tesla. Now let me go to the reception of this wave in a circuit, and I have some free electrons in my circuit, and in comes the wave from the vacuum. The electrons in the circuit are pushing against their brothers down the road, which pushes back, and it's restrained. It's very difficult for it to move longitudinally. We know that today. We know that it only moves down the wire at something like 11 feet per hour. The signal that moves down the wire at near light speed will have completely exited the solar system and gone on by that time. So as you can see, we have a very sluggish electron restrained, which is spinning, we know today. When they wrote those equations, they didn't even have the notion of the electron. So it acts as a gyro. And by gyro theory, right out of the book, when you longitudinally disturb a gyro that's restrained, it will precess sideways. And all of our instruments measure and detect the electron precession waves. That's what we put on our oscilloscopes and what we read with our instruments. And yes, indeed, gentlemen, we do detect the electron wiggle waves, and they are transverse waves. But a gyro reacts and precesses at right angle to the actual disturbance, which proves that it is a longitudinal wave in the vacuum. If you do not believe that, you must throw away all gyro theory. Tesla was right. Every textbook in the U.S. is wrong. Maxwell simply assumed out of thin air the transverse string wave because that's what everybody was familiar with when he wrote the first equations, and it's never been changed to this day.
So was Tesla aware of this, and is this what Tesla was talking about when he talked about teleforce?
It was deeply involved in it. Tesla made several statements, for example, over and over, where he said, there are no transverse waves in the vacuum, no Hertz waves. The waves in the vacuum, I have already proved, he said, is like a gas. And the waves in it, therefore, are like sound waves. They are longitudinal waves. And he was indeed correct. Today, for example, in modern quantum mechanics, there is a vacuum, it is a medium, and it's a virtual particle flux. And so, indeed, the vacuum is a virtual gas by today's best physics. And Tesla was right. It is a longitudinal wave. And I've just explained how it's split. When it's received, you do get what we measure with our instruments because of the electron precession. And you also get the anti-wave at the same time, proving that it was an extra wave there down in the nucleus, in the materials, which do recoil, and we just ignore it. We know it's there, but we just ignore it. Now let's look, for example, at his statement of wireless transmission. Here he was talking of the transmission of energy through the atmosphere, or indeed through space, without loss. As a matter of fact, if that is true, then it already exists in nature. Tesla had rediscovered nature. As a matter of fact, today in modern theory, we know that the energy in an electromagnetic wave transmitted is already conserved. If you take a wavelength at any length from an omni-transmitter, and you take the hemispherical shell of that wavelength times the entire surface area of that shell, the energy that's in that shell is the same as the energy in any other shell of any radius. The energy is totally conserved and none of it is lost. We already know that. That part is absolutely correct. The energy density, of course, goes way down as the shell expands. So that part is unquestionable. Now the question is, can we direct that and can we control it? In a sense, if we do a laser beam, we do that. There's a better way to do it. If we go to Whittaker's paper, which was written in 1903, and some other papers have been written since then, like by Ziolkowski and by Sue in 1993, even, Ziolkowski in the 80s, a strange thing comes about. What we call the electrostatic scalar potential, that is pure voltage, to simplify it, can be broken down into a bidirectional set of wave pairs, one wave going one way, the other way time reversed, and locked on it in space. So what we call just voltage or just potential is actually got a hidden set, incredible amount of waves going in both directions. And not only we consider it just a fixed value at a point in space, but as a matter of fact, it's a tremendous energy flow. So what Tesla really discovered was how to combine the waves so that they eliminated the gradients, technically speaking. The gradients opposed each other, but were still there, but now hidden. The net gradient, the net force field, was gone. We know today the other electromagnetics is still there, and we have an energy flow in both directions. So he simply found out how to do that. And yes, indeed, there is no loss in that kind of potential. If you make a beam of that, you can indeed transmit energy in a completely hidden fashion. You can stick a normal meter right in the beam and it won't see a thing because there's no force field. And you can transmit it at a distance. How effectively depends on the ability to make the beam, how narrow you can make the beam and hold it together. And the other thing depends on a slight interaction with the atmosphere in the middle. You'll spill a little, but you can do it 98% or so, which I think is what Tesla said. Also, there's one other thing we must say about that. There is emerging in the last few years, and has emerged in orthodox science at an advanced level, what I would say is the very beginning, but it's moving pretty fast, theory of force-free fields. And these are getting very close to what Tesla was doing. They haven't added the anti-wave back in yet, but they're getting close. At least they're eliminating the overall force and doing something else with the electromagnetics that remains. The other thing which must be brought to bear, and I must do this very precisely to understand Tesla, is the fact that, for example, if you read Jackson and classical electrodynamics, you will find when he's first setting out in the first so many pages, he points out very clearly that this theory, this very beautiful theory, only holds when the background is reasonably well behaved, reasonably linear. He points out that if the background becomes nonlinear, that you must then turn to the emerging field or the field that has emerged in nonlinear optics. Nonlinear optics in some fashions is an unfortunate term because the mechanisms are fundamental. They apply to all frequencies and they apply to all kinds of waves. It's a matter of when the background gets sufficiently nonlinear to induce these phenomena. So as long as you continue to try to keep the background linear, which we're great at doing, we try really to sweep out these phenomena. Tesla had stumbled into this area very early on and mastered part of this area long before the terminology I'm using existed. He knew how to do, number one, what today we call phase conjugation. He knew how to do what we call pumped phase conjugation, and he even knew how to do what we call technically today amongst very few people self-targeting. So he had some tools at his fingertips which he could use on the lab bench and build equipment he worked on an enormous number of years on, which could do things that the normal electromagnetics cannot do. We do some of them today in nonlinear optics. Now let me talk about self-targeting so you can understand some of his transmission without loss. One of the problems we have, like for example in something like missile defense, if I have a spaceborne laser, let me say, and I have a rising enemy booster 10, 15,000 miles away, I've got a problem. I've got lots of power. I can put the laser beam onto the booster, but I must hold it on one particular spot 15,000 miles away, on that exact spot, a long enough time called dwell time to burn through the casing and destroy the booster. So I have a problem. How do I hold this beam there and keep it from wandering around in the body of the booster? Well, it turns out you can do it very easily with a thing called self-targeting. Every signal that comes from there, if I phase conjugate and transmit a phase conjugate replica, it goes unerringly back to the spot, including it led it a little bit because the component of its motion was on the beam that came to me. And so if I continue to do that iteratively, I can hold the beam exactly on the booster and burn through it. So by self-targeting, I can hold a laser beam on a point. It doesn't have to be a booster, a defense, or anything. I can hold a beam of energy onto a point that I have at a distance. That's the main thing by self-targeting. And in my own opinion, I reached the opinion that Tesla, in his telegeodynamics, had discovered how to do that with the mechanical waves. First of all, he could transmit the full wave through the Earth, and he could cause the thing when it came back to be phase conjugated. Once he had a reflection from anywhere, he could narrow immediately into that point and put all his energy to that point. And today, there is a theoretical basis for it. I couldn't build such equipment, but I mean there's a theoretical way to go to do that. And apparently, according to his statements, that's my interpretation of what he was doing. He was doing iterative phase conjugation and therefore able to focus his energy, regardless of what kind of route it followed, to the exact point he wanted it to go to on the other side of the Earth.
But now, was this theoretical or was this ever demonstrated?
I believe he demonstrated it. For example, my personal opinion, and I certainly cannot prove this in a court of law, and I want to label it as a personal opinion. My personal opinion, because of certain time sequences of some of his statements and incidents which actually happened, I think as a last desperate measure while his installation at Long Island was still intact and still in operation, I believe he fired the electrical pulse of energy that blew down that forest in Siberia. Oliver Nicholson has done some very good work, for example, to look at the admittedly circumstantial evidence. We can't prove it at all. I just happen to hold to the thesis that it was his last-ditch effort to try to solve his problems that he'd lost with Morgan by focusing attention onto the absolute power that could be unleashed with this. And it failed. Nobody was interested. I was very curious about the time correlation between his installation still existing on Long Island, still in operation, and this Siberian particular blast and its characteristics, which it was not a nuclear weapon, it was not a meteorite. So in doing a little work on that, thanks to Oliver Nicholson, he sent me some very good information on that, and it's not the kind of thing you can ever say with any certainty happened, certainly not. But there is at least circumstantial evidence that he may have done that. In speaking of nuclear energy and Tesla's objection to it, and some of the things he had in mind with energy, it's pretty obvious that Tesla not only knew how, but advocated very strongly that you could do this electromagnetically, and you could do it cleanly and cheaply without all the nuclear residue and the nuclear waste and the long-term effects and this kind of thing. You know, it's tough to dispose of nuclear waste. Now, I have mixed feelings on this. For example, I am a nuclear engineer. I have a master's degree from Georgia Tech, but I'm not a practicing nuclear engineer, nor have I ever been. The Army really didn't see fit to let me do that. Nonetheless, I know a little bit about what they're about and so forth, and a nuclear power plant is not a great breakthrough in technology at all. It's a great heater. And what we really do, we use the nuclear reactions to produce heat, and we either boil water and make steam, or we just use the hot water. And then it's the heat energy that we must convert to provide our electric power. Now, the demand for electric power is great enough. It's a big enough problem, as everybody is aware. If we must continue to furnish this electric power at our present science level, there's no really acceptable alternative yet to the nuclear power plant. However, it doesn't mean that that's the preferable solution by any means. I think it's preferable the other way, which is why I work so hard to try to do it electromagnetically. Now, at this very conference that we're at when this interview is being made, I'm going to introduce what is almost the final results of my 30 years of work in this area. And what we have done is very similar to what Tesla did, and he provided the codes, the clues on which to look. What I've done is taken him to heart and convinced myself with a lot of investigation and study the waves in the vacuum are longitudinal. So when electromagnetic waves break loose from their mass restriction and holding, they are longitudinal waves. And when they get tied up in mass, they get split into these two waves, one of which is acting upon the electrons to cause them to move sideways, and they slip a little bit every once in a while down the wire, creates Newton's third law reaction in the nucleus. Well, when you go through enough analysis of this, what you really find, and what as of Friday of this week, yesterday, I have filed, my associates and I should say, have filed a very fundamental patent on the creation in a circuit of longitudinal waves to flow the energy freely, literally in the Tesla fashion, and then use it separately in a load to power a load. And technically, it's still called displacement current. What we have done, we have split the normal current, technically dq dt, into two components, one being displacement current, d phi dt, and one being that mass slippage every once in a while of these precessing electrons down the wire. And what we really have done is used a barrier invented by Bill Fogel to stop the mass flow, which is all the workflow, the rate at which energy is being lost in the circuit. We allow only the flow past Fogel's semiconductor, which is a patented device, patented in 92. And then we use this free energy flow, which just does not disperse. Conventional theory already recognizes displacement current as pure energy transport without losses. For example, the way to use it, and I want everybody to know so they can check it, if I then run the displacement current through the primary of its step-up transformer, I produce ordinary garden variety magnetic field and store that free energy in that magnetic field. That couples to the secondary, which then couples to the electrons in that circuit through the load, which are now free to move. I don't restrain them. and I pump the electrons through the load absolutely conventionally and do power in the load. So what I have is absolute conservation of energy, but I do not conserve work loss, the dissipation of the energy. I take the energy in almost freely from the battery or power source. In this case, it would be an oscillator because I'm speaking AC. We can do a DC. I strip off and block the component of the current that's responsible for all losses in the circuit. Then I take the displacement current and I couple it, gather it, and store it in this case magnetic field, couple it to the other side, and discharge it through the load completely separately. None of my load discharge current goes back through my source. No degradation is done to the source. And yes, indeed, you can legitimately do over-unity electrical systems, and it's exactly analogous to a heat pump, which is a proven over-unity system that we use in our homes. I just told the world how to build a free energy machine, is what I told them. Okay, now, if we assume that what I've explained about the way we have approached the use of the energy which is freely available from the vacuum energy is now acceptable even in physical review, thanks to some fine work by people of the stature of Hal Puthoff, for example. It's very, very straightforward, very technical, and it's now an acceptable thing. We know the vacuum, and it is accepted. It is filled with energy. And Tesla always said that it was. So once again, Tesla has been vindicated by modern quantum mechanics after all of these years. I think if we look at some of the other incidents, as for example, Tesla talked about being able to tap the energy of cosmic rays. He talked, in fact, his nephew reported as a child riding in the car where Tesla had put in an engine of some kind which was self-powered. So we find then later references to Tesla which suggest the harnessing of energy from, today we would say, from the vacuum. So does that sound reasonable to us today from where I'm coming from? Yes, indeed, because that's exactly what we have done. We take it in the potential across the source. We simply use the hidden wave flow from the Whittaker stuff. We want to extract that and use it in this displacement current form while it's still energy flow and none of it's being lost. We do not wish to make work until we store it up and discharge it in the load separately. We do it just like a heat pump. And I really think that's probably the way Tesla did it in that car engine. He also knew there was enormous energy in what was called cosmic rays, and he connected that with the whole idea of the energetic vacuum, we would say today. And I think that's just one of the ways he referred to it. For example, we know from T. Henry Moray's work that he was inspired by Tesla's statement that the energy of the ether itself was literally filled with rivers of energy free for the taking. It inspired him in his great undertaking. Today, the fashion is to sweep that aside and say, well, I know what he was doing. Tesla just didn't know. He was using this stuff that I know all about. And so I talk about the Earth ionospheric waveguide and resonance, and that's not what he was doing at all. You can't do free energy for the whole world with Earth ionospheric resonance. It isn't going to happen. We know about that. It isn't going to happen. Another area that often occurs in discussions of Tesla is the notion of weaponization of Tesla's true work that's relatively unknown to modern science, but could probably be known to some very sharp people that looked into it because they wanted to make weapons. Tesla certainly spoke of a very large series of very powerful weapons. I think that's a reasonable thing, and let's approach it this way. Certainly I'm on record as saying the weapons exist and that several nations have weaponized them. Let me explain a little bit about what I'm talking about and a little bit key points where you might look. We know for a fact that, for example, T. Henry Moray, with his power supply, was visited by the Russians, and we know that the Russians tried to, in fact, take it. They even tried to kidnap T. Henry Moray. And so we know that the Russians very early on were interested in things like free energy right out of the vacuum, and they were interested in weapons. There are even reports that they contacted Tesla, and I'm sure they would have. He certainly had plenty of headlines. So if we have that then as a starting point, we have a situation where in the late 30s particularly, and just prior to World War II, there was at least some kind of interest in contact. We know in the case of T. Henry Moore, they very probably got the exact blueprints for how to build the device. Maybe a couple things missing in here and there, but a really good lab could have eventually put it together from there. Then comes along World War II, the big interruption for everyone. Okay, at that time, after World War II, we have a very strange situation which exists now. First thing that exists, we have suddenly thrust upon the world scene the atomic bomb. If we had not done so, we would have had a bloodbath when we tried to invade Japan. So many lives were saved by the use of the atomic bomb, and I am not an atomic bomb apologist. Many people who are here today would not be here if their fathers had been killed by the invasion of Japan, and depending on who you believe, the casualties would have been about 1 million on our side alone. Anyway, we arrived at this state in the world where now there's a very powerful weapon which suddenly frustrates one of the things that Stalin has planned to do. Stalin, of course, had a spy in the atomic bomb project. He knew we were getting ready, so it wasn't a big surprise to him at Potsdam when Truman told him that we had just exploded the first atomic bomb. But he had been planning after Europe, after the European War and everything wound down, he would hold his armies for about 2 years. We always beat our swords back into plowshares and go home. Historically, it's the last war, never going to be another one. And unfortunately, human nature doesn't change, and so there is another one. And Stalin, in about 2 years, would keep all his armies intact and simply take over Europe in about 6 weeks. That was his plan. However, now he couldn't do that, because if he massed his forces, we would have bombed him back into the Stone Age. So he had a problem. There is at least reason to believe that Stalin called in his scientific heads when he got back from Potsdam and really laid the law down to them. He said, the destiny of communism has been frustrated by this great new American development. That isn't going to be the last great breakthrough, but I tell you, gentlemen, one thing, the next one is going to be Soviet. So he forcefully ordered them to search for the next great area, in my opinion, to look for that breakthrough. Because thereafter you find Soviet scientists combing through everything. For example, they took the entire scientific literature of the West, loaded on copies on the boats, took it back to Russia, set up huge translations institutes, staffed with very highly qualified scientists, and their job was to go through, look for anything anomalous. The anomalies they laid aside, then they went through them with a fine-tooth comb and to see what looked promising. And, of course, they would have found such things. We've never done anything like that. They would have found such things as the Whitaker Papers, a lot of marvelous things I haven't even found yet that's in the literature that nobody's ever paid any attention to. So my thesis is that that's what happened. They started into this area for building a new superweapon immediately after World War II. Certainly they would have resurrected this Moray stuff they had gotten out of T. Henry Moray's lab through their agent. They would have probably resurrected other things I don't even know about. That's just conjecture, but probably so. At any rate, they did start such a program. The Russians have always been the greatest nonlinear mathematicians in the world. They were at the beginning, they are to this day. And so they would have seen much more clearly into the nonlinear aspects of everything we're talking about than American scientists had seen to date, which means they would have picked up what today we call the optical type functioning, which means they would have picked up the longitudinal waves. They certainly falsified general relativity theory. Only later, many years later, did they openly publish the fact that it's wrong and show why it's wrong and become, recognized critics of the conventional general relativity. In this country, we did exactly the opposite. We defended it to the last man. So they went much deeper, I think, during this period into these areas than we did. And I think they started building because, as you know from my own previous publications, I put together independently a rather large body of evidence, admittedly circumstantial, but real nonetheless, that can only be explained by the testing of such weapons. There is absolutely no other explanation for it. Now, I could be wrong on one incident, but 200 of exactly the same kind, I think not. So the evidence is overwhelming, and you even hear now their own leaders, like Zhirinovsky recently has referred to these weapons as the ellipton weapons. There is no question today that the Soviet Union has these weapons. And if what I put together is correct, and I'm absolutely convinced it is, 3 other nations of the world also developed those weapons and resoundingly checked the Soviet Union. The other 3 are friendly to the United States, not hostile. And I think that played one great part in the fall of the Soviet Empire, because their original target date, as I brought out, had been 85 to achieve the freedom to move and do what they wished in the world in 1985. And they met the schedule, as I've adequately reported. But once checked, then we have a very strange situation. Now communism falls because of its financial shortcomings, and they just flat can't keep it glued together anymore. And in the dissolution here, we have entered what I think is a much more dangerous world than anything we ever thought of. 3 other nations today are indeed working on what I call the Tesla weapons, or really scalar electromagnetic weapons. And these nations are not really friendly to the U.S. at all. So it's a much more dangerous world that has emerged. The nuclear control that was executed by the Soviet Union is now probably been diluted. You can hire, if you're careful, you can hire some Soviet scientists right off the project. Many nations today are developing nuclear weapons, and they don't have to go through the pain we did. They're hiring people who already know how to do that and have done so. So very shortly, you will see emerging throughout the so-called Third World, as it's so loosely referred to, you will see nuclear weapons. You will see the extended Scud, for example, being developed in North Korea, aided by the Chinese, and is being expropriated to the Mideast. And in my opinion, you will see a nuclear and biological warfare in the Middle East in 3 or 4 years, somewhere on that time range. I could be off a year or 2, but it isn't going to be forever. So to me, it's a much more dangerous world that we live in, particularly if we see the advent, in addition to the nukes and the biological warfare, which is certainly frightening enough, if we see the advent of several other nations now possessing weapons of the ilk and power spoken of, although at a little bit obliquely, by Nikola Tesla. I would like to explain the basis for the weapons, because it's open. If you take the 2 papers by Whitaker that I'm so fond of quoting in all my stuff, you will find that the first one tells you, if you do it in reverse, tells you how to make, if you wish, a scalar beam by simply assembling the necessary wave set. The second paper will tell you that if you then take 2 such scalar beams, actually hidden multi-waves, and interfere them at a distance, yes, scalar interferometry really exists. It's just really multiple wave interferometry when you understand the wave sets. What will occur at a distance will be the reappearance of the electromagnetic gradients, which we call force fields. In other words, you'll create the electromagnetics at a distance. If you bias your ground potential of your transmitters higher than the distant focal point, what we call energy, heat energy, exhaustion of energy, which should be called work, heat energy will emerge in the other area and scatter at that area. Energy will go in here and scatters work out the other end. It's just like you had a direct pipeline at a distance. Is this indicative of Tesla? Of course. If you bias your projectors the other way, the energy flows in the other direction. In other words, you extract energy from out there, and the energy, you have to do something to collect and dissipate the heat back at the transmitter end. Every transmitter is now a 2-way transmitter of energy. I can make it go in one direction by biasing or go in the other at will. The weapon implications of that alone are extremely frightening and extremely powerful, and now several nations are involved in developing it right straightforward to the hilt. Very shortly, we will have an even more frightening world emerging. The other thing you can do with it, which I think Tesla alluded to at least in a few cases, when you do these things with the potentials rather than with the force fields, you actually involve time. You produce time effects, or you can produce effects on anything that exists in time, because you affect the time dimension. When you do this, you can affect thought, and you can affect human beings where they live, because thought occurs in time. It occupies time. It's just not spatial, but it is time-like. As you can probably see, if indeed the world has already acquired, several nations, the ability to build the defensive weapons in the area that has been discussed here, the Tesla-type weapons, then there's really no longer a great compelling need to do any further weapons work by any private citizen. So there are some other very compelling areas, however, of great need for humanity that are directly involved with Tesla's approach and Tesla's work that cry out for research and development. Two of these areas are fantastic. We must have clean energy sources. We must have some source to provide our needed electrical power cleanly and freely without polluting this entire biosphere. Everybody's concerned with that. The way to do it is not to put in harsh laws that stop all workers and everything like this and go into absolute dictatorship. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to do it scientifically by striking for a great new breakthrough to where it can be done, and done cheaply and cleanly. So that's one area that, is important and deserves the utmost effort that can be put on it. Another area that is assuming ever more increasing urgency is the area of the medical needs. Allopathic medicine is failing. The bugs are all changing, and they're becoming immune to all our antibiotics. The orthodox scientific people are saying this openly in their journals and their articles and their editorials. Even the newspaper and Newsweek and so forth are picking it up and writing articles about it. Within 5 years, you will have a serious risk of your life, if this trend continues, just to go to the hospital. The number's already over 10,000 per year. I don't know the exact number since '92, but it's already well above 10,000 per year that die in the hospital because the infection that they have absolutely cannot be controlled. There is one kind of staph, for example, that nothing that we have will affect, and it has about a 30% lethality, I'm told. So 3 out of 10 who contact that die in the hospital. These kinds of things are increasing. You now have very well recognized scientists in the regular medical scientific community saying allopathic medicine is failing, and there's nothing to replace it. You cannot develop the vaccines or new compounds fast enough to even keep up with them. We have lost that battle. We must change the medical approach. The medical approach, if you use the extended electromagnetics, if I may use that term, that Tesla was talking about, there then occurs phenomena which can be used to control and change and heal almost any infectious disease whatsoever, including a genetic disease such as where the genetics have changed in the cells, such as AIDS. Now, that is not an idle statement. That is a very rigorous statement based on some very rigorous scientific work done in France in the late 60s and early 70s by Antoine Priori and a team of scientists that gathered and worked with him. And these were eminent scientists, world known. For example, one of them was Robert Courier, head of the biology section of the French Academy of Science, and also the secretary perpetuel of the French Academy at the same time. Potrezel, an eminent scientist, world known. Many such scientists worked directly with the inventor Antoine Priori. Priori completed his doctoral thesis, which was rejected because of the violent opposition of the medical establishment. But he demonstrated under rigorous scientific protocols that you could completely cure, almost with ridiculous ease, terminal tumors in lab animals. He did it hundreds of times under all the proper rigid controls. I mean, Courier personally sent his own personal assistant to do the tumor grafts and ensure that everything was absolutely impeccable. Very simple. You take 15 rats, 30 rats, 15 each, one control group, one test group. All the rats get inoculated or grafted with the same terminal tumor. They're going to be dead with 100% certainty in 30 days. The 15 get treated, the other 15 don't. They stay in exactly the same room, same food, same everything. The 15 treated all get well. The 15 not treated all die with another provision. You can then take another group of 15 rats with the same tumors grafted to them. You can take one drop of blood from each of the rats that got well and put in each one of the other rats, and they will all get well from that single drop of blood. The ordinary medical establishment was furious. When they changed the setup of the French government to a leftist government in the mid-'70s, the priori team was just completing a very large installation with permission to treat human patients with terminal cancer and leukemia and so forth. Now, he surreptitiously treated some humans before and cured their cancers and leukemias. The problem was nobody could understand how it worked. We didn't even have at the time the knowledge of this new parts of phase conjugate optics that we needed to understand it. It's no wonder they couldn't understand it. Nobody could. And so when they suppressed that, they withdrew the funding from the project. It was funded by the French government. And when the government changed, they withdrew the funding. All the work ceased. The equipment later was destroyed. Priori later died. At any rate, this is something absolutely legitimate. It did use the type of electromagnetic extension that I've talked about. And if we open up that extension, there now is the explanation available of how it worked. And yes, we can cure such diseases if a proper scientific development program can be mounted and funded. And it will all be based in part upon the work of Nikola Tesla. Often there's been a great curiosity about this strange thing the Russians suddenly injected onto the world. They had done some pre-testing, but suddenly on July the 4th, 1976, for a bicentennial present for us, the Soviets opened up some great new transmitters in the communication band, which, because of the chirping sound and the sound just like a woodpecker's bill hitting a block of wood, was immediately dubbed woodpecker by all the ham radio operators who had it interfering with their communications. And so this was really massive communication, massive transmitters, lots and lots of power. And nobody could figure out what in the world was going on. It made no sense because certainly the signals as seen could do over-the-horizon radar work, which you normally put in that same frequency band. But there were also apparently lots of characteristics which didn't fit what you would do if you were designing something that was just over-the-horizon radar at all. There would be no need for such complexity. So there's been a lot of discussion on it, and, I guess the official realization was that, or calling it, was to say it's just simply over-the-horizon radars. Well, they built a lot of them. But if you look at it through the eyes of the scalar interferometry, and I mentioned the two references and have cited them in various papers, there are other work along that line too. If that approach is used in what seems to be what Tesla had done, if you use the Tesla approach to interpret it, now one is dealing with scalar interferometry and dealing with something that can do some rather astounding potential weapon effects. With the Tesla interpretation, one of the things that would result from that line of weapons, assuming they are used as scalar interferometry weapons, one of the great things that would emerge from them would be to produce controlled energy at a distance. For example, great huge balls of controlled electromagnetic energy, or if you pulse it, great blasts of electromagnetic energy at a distance. I mentioned the business of biasing the transmitters, where you can produce either heat, like an explosion, or you could produce a cold explosion, the sudden explosive withdrawal of energy from the distant area. And in books cited incidents that are representative of what one would find if those incidents actually were occurring on that kind of scale. The incidents are there, they're real, they're documented, they're not just Tom Bearden. So there is a good solid set of admittedly circumstantial evidence that the woodpecker signals, because of all the phenomena that can be associated in the same time frame since they turned on, these phenomena very strongly suggest that this set of weapons is not just over-the-horizon radars at all, but are really Tesla weapon systems. And if they are, all the rest follows. They have one other frightening area, if this thesis is true, that is almost mind-boggling. There is a Soviet physicist, scientist named Kosnashev, and Kosnashev has produced a series of experiments in two Soviet military institutes before the fall there that showed that you could transmit any sort of disease form between cells. Any sort of infectious disease, or you can radiate one sample with nuclear radiation, gamma radiation, for example, or deadly poison, or infect them with viruses. You can transmit between cellular cultures into another cell, another sample from the same culture, the same disease electromagnetically, although the organisms won't necessarily be there. That works in literature if you pursue it. Kosnashev has several books out now that are available since the Russian system has loosened up a bit. That work has been replicated at the University of Marburg, for example, in Germany. It has been replicated at the University of Sydney in Australia, and it has been replicated by at least one researcher here in the United States. He's trained to say if there are no force fields, there's no electromagnetics. He ignores the potential that's left. He just sweeps it away and throws it away. From where we're coming from with the Tesla approach, that is the active part. That's the part that is being interfered within the bodies or whatever to cause whatever you wish to cause. If we couple it with the Kosnashev stuff, we are saying that such scalar transmitters in interferometry within the U.S. Embassy could indeed have produced any sort of disease they wish. However, it would have very strange signatures. Let me explain the signatures and how such signatures actually came about. First of all, when Nixon went as vice president to Russia, and this was first detected, he was going to visit some nuclear installations, and they carried Geiger counters, and it was detected on the Geiger counter. It's an ionization device. It detects the ionization and discharge of its own gases, and anything that will ionize its gas, it will detect. It doesn't have to be nuclear radiation. And so they thought at first that it was deadly nuclear radiation because all the counters went off. And indeed it was not. They were irradiating the president with this stuff, with the Tesla stuff, to see if we knew what was going on. That's a beautiful intelligence probe. You pick out a high-level target like the president or, the embassy. You radiate and do some things that are obvious, not too bad, but are obvious, so they can't be missed. And then you see what happens when the system goes bananas trying to figure out what's going on. And by their actions, there's no way to fake it. You either tell them you know what's going on by your action, or you show them you don't know what's going on. There's no way to get out of it. It's 100% certain, which very few things in intelligence are. However, if I go back to the embassy where many health changes and diseases and so forth, 3 ambassadors died of a leukemia-like illness eventually. These diseases occurred only within the embassy in those areas where the force fields were absent and the potentials were there. And the Johns Hopkins researchers did a beautiful job. They were expert guys of establishing the force field electromagnetic pattern. And since not a single case occurred in that area, that's by the normal electromagnetics, then reached the conclusion that therefore could not possibly be the microwave radiation. Actually, that's a false conclusion. If the radiation played no part whatsoever and you had that many changes occurred, the odds are extremely high that some of those would have occurred in the area where there were force fields and some didn't. Since that did not occur, it is a 100% correlation to the Tesla area, to the area where the potentials existed and the force fields did not. And I'm sorry, they reached exactly the wrong conclusion because the model they applied failed them. These were able scientists using only the conventional model, and the model actually showed that it was the other stuff, but led them to conclude properly for their model that it couldn't possibly be the electromagnetics. That's just one instance. So the woodpecker then would be able to apply because of so many signals. The scalar stuff we might not even see with our normal detectors, but yet it could do exactly the same thing, for example, in the United States alone. Now, what does that imply? If we are not too far out into left field here, if there's really a ground, as I've tried to describe here, if there really is a theoretical ground here for the use of those weapons in a Tesla mode, and the use of the Kosnashev knowledge and experimental results in here, apparently confirmed by what happened in the U.S. Embassy, then those radiators, which are active to this day, not in the conventional sense, you got to have a different detector, those radiators could conceivably create, within a mass population, almost the instantaneous spread of mass diseases of all kind. They would be anomalous. You'd be dying, for example, of bubonic plague, and you wouldn't have the organism. But it represents, if that part is true, it represents a biological weapon of incredible implications for population warfare. I hope to God I'm wrong. I don't think I am. One of the questions for anybody who tries to take the Tesla view and tries to do it anywhere halfway scientifically, one of the questions that certainly comes out of all this other work on what kind of possible weapons could have been built and what possible uses and demonstrations have been made, the question emerges, what about warfare in the future? Well, what I can do is give you my opinion and leave it up to each person to evaluate that as they see fit. We have certain trends, however, that certainly are possible. We see with certainty other nations developing nuclear weapons. Shortly, almost everybody that wants to have a nuclear weapon and is a nation of any little size at all is going to have one. I would characterize that by the fact that weapons of mass destruction have now passed out of chess-playing hands, in other words, logical hands, into some hands which are irrational. And to me, that's a much more dangerous world. There is another thing. Suppose, the fear all analysts have is the suitcase delivery system. You simply slip in the weapon parts and assemble it, say, in New York City or Chicago or someplace. And perhaps the next time the U.S. decides to intervene somewhere in the Middle East or somewhere, the terrorists then blow several of these weapons. Incredible damage to the United States. This would suggest an area where not only have the great nations been involved in strategic deterrence, if I might use that term, which is now falling out of fashion, but all the small nations, or a lot of them, will be able to provide a very positive strategic deterrence to even great nations by the threat of nuclear warfare, clandestine warfare as I described, or biological weapons which are cheap and everybody can have and build. It is certainly a much more dangerous weapon that has emerged, world that has emerged, and the weapon spread now is just, it's seeping out just like a torrent. There's no stopping it in these kinds of weapons. One doesn't know what will be the future in the slow leakage that seems to be going on in the Tesla weapons. Certainly, it simply adds to the pile at the very best for us, the threat. And at the worst, it adds an impossible threat. So the world is facing a set of dangerous possibilities, dangerous threats to us all, to everybody, to every man, woman, and child, because the civilian population is no longer immune or even exempted from these kinds of things. We're facing a world of possibility of multiple nations, multiple kinds of irrational groups being able to apply enormous weapons of enormous implications to even the civilian population. Our military, for example, is facing a situation where, with a lot of development in biological warfare, if suddenly new agents that you have no knowledge of whatsoever are thrust upon you, you have no antidotes, you have no effective methods of treatment, and these are fairly rapidly acting agents. Let's say they kill in 2 days. Rapid infection, I'm just taking an example. You couldn't possibly come up with anything to do anything with the normal stuff during that time. The only alternative will be the extended electromagnetic treatment, because then you could treat it without identifying the agent and cure it before it even came out in illness in your troops. Otherwise, even your military forces face decimation by sudden unknown agents which they are unable to counter. So surprise attack becomes an ever more dangerous thing in a lot more dangerous hands. The world is much more dangerous today. For a much more positive application of shall I say, Tesla's extension to electromagnetics that he was using, though not technically describing so well, something that's much more beneficial, or can be, to mankind, humankind, rather than destructive means. One should focus on the imminent advent of practical over-unity electromagnetic devices. These are devices which can be closed-loop to run themselves and produce useful power in the load. For one impact, which is highly beneficial, it's obvious to the most casual observer that the use of such systems, where the power to run it is actually extracted from the vacuum itself, if carefully used, there will be no damage to the biosphere, and we will certainly eliminate an incredible amount gradually. It won't happen overnight, but we will gradually eliminate an incredible amount of burning of fossil fuels. There's still a need for all the fossil fuels, only not as fuel. The chemical needs alone for medicines and materials and so forth to benefit mankind are enormous. But certainly we will stop all the exhausts and pollutants from the burning of those fuels from entering the atmosphere. It just won't be happening anymore to the extent it is now on any scale. It will allow us to take funds, for example, on something like into what I like to think could be a more sane world and a much more protective of the environment of our children and of our children's children. Now, in all candor, I must add one danger if unrestrictedly used. When you produce excess energy of this type from the vacuum, right in the vacuum in a local area, if you produce a very large amount, particularly if you do it very suddenly, in that region you have a curvature of local space-time. And there can be biological effects from that we are presently not quite capable of fully explaining or knowing. There's going to have to be some careful incorporation of the devices so that we use care. We do not inflict any kind of damage on anybody or anything like that. So with reasonable scientific care, we can prevent any such thing, and we should do that. We should incorporate such systems into our normal utility transmissions across the lines. The lines are there. The maintenance of them is already there. The facilities are already there. They're already connected to the homes. It would just be nice if gradually we didn't have to burn so many fossil fuels, and gradually the power price could come down cheaper and cheaper, but meanwhile everybody stays working and everybody stays involved. But what we really wish to eliminate is, say, an older person in New York City, cold in the winter, very limited income, can't pay the utility bill very well, so has to keep the power down, freezing, eating dog food. We must do better than that, and we can. And the Tesla technology will allow us to do better than that. So it must be done. To understand Tesla, you must understand one other remarkable ability that he had that none of his peers had then or now. We can only do with great computing simulation centers. From the time he was an early child, Tesla had the capability to visualize something so intensely and so vividly that he simply couldn't tell the difference between that and a real object until he was about 12 years old, and he finally found a way to distinguish the difference. But this unique ability that he had enabled him to visualize a system in all of its parts working together, turn it over and upside down and inside out, and watch everything function on any level that today we would do with a large CAD-CAM system, or we would do with a very large supercomputer in a very large simulation facility. So Tesla also was the world's first great simulating computer center using his own brain. None of his cohorts, or his colleagues, or his peers had any such ability. Tesla would build a device 100 times in his head, changing it all the time until he got all the parts working perfectly in his simulation. And then he would build it on the bench, and most times it would work right away. He had already built it 100 times. We do exactly that technique today in many fields of endeavor with great effort, with great cost, big computing centers. Tesla could do it in his head. One final question often remains about Nikola Tesla. It's difficult to put oneself in a situation to believe that he could possibly have done such great things, and they have passed completely away into either secrecy or being lost or just simply abandoned. So a puzzling question remains. How on earth could this happen? Suppose it's true. How could it happen? Actually, it's not too difficult to understand how, but it takes a bit of background and appreciation for the times. First of all, put yourself in Tesla's day. When we're talking about installation on Long Island, it hasn't been very long since Custer's last stand. We're talking about just prior to Marconi's transmission of signals across the Atlantic. We're talking about a time when only recently, in just the end of the 1880s and the early 1890s, has electromagnetics abandoned the quaternion theory and gone to the vector theory of Oliver Heaviside, largely, and with some contribution by Hertz and Gibbs. There are only, at the time, prior to the turn of the century, possibly about 40 scientists in the world who really understand electromagnetics at the top level. There are more than that who are, we might say, followers, but the shapers, there's only about no such thing as a big government science. There are no large government organizations funding science anywhere. A scientist was relatively a poor person. You know, he wasn't impoverished, but he certainly had no income like a businessman. There was no place to get grants or to get funding for research. All science is patronized. Somebody has to pay the freight. And many of the avenues we are familiar with today, most of them, simply did not exist. The only way that a scientist, or call him an inventor such as Tesla, could in fact even dream of supporting himself, he had to, number one, discover the thing. He had to keep it very, very secret and patent it. He had to keep it secret until his patent actually was issued. Some money. A scientist at a university who received a $2,000 grant from an industrialist was in great shape. Think of the economics of the time. An average person might make $500 a year. When we speak of $150,000, an enormous sum of money in that time. But we're speaking of a time when there's still not many checks and balances on the great capitalists. Literally, they buy the politicians at will. The control of financial power had little opposition in the courts or anything else. It was so bad at the time that there was a violent labor movement going on against the very same industrialists who kept manipulating the stock market and causing it to change and causing inflation and terribly hurting everybody. Anarchy was even a serious threat because of the belief that all government was evil, prevailing in the laboring class. An anarchist even assassinated the president while Lincoln is working on while Tesla is working on Long Island. So one must appreciate the tenor of the times. Also, one must appreciate the communication industry. There were very few telephones. The telegraph, which wasn't widespread, but the telegraph existed, that was the main route of communication, and newspapers. Books to some extent. The journals were all pretty well controlled, most of them, by the scientific community, who's already, very much jealous of Tesla. So you don't publish in the real scientific journals. You have to publish in something like what today would call Scientific American, like Electrical Experimenter or something. And many of the publications were letter to the editor. So an inventor or a person trying to make a living in science as an independent person had a terrible job and a terrible task. There was a great secrecy clamp on him just because of the situation and tenor of the times. This accounted really to a large degree for Tesla's secrecy. Most other inventors who had not yet become highly successful or whatever were also very secret, or who still needed large funding. So secrets and secretiveness was the order of the day. Only when you put it in this background can you understand then how easy it is to suppress. It's not printed in the newspaper. It's his single exposition of receiving signals from outer space caused most of the news media to simply swing over and go against him. The very news media who had simply made him a star, so to speak, before, now couldn't get enough to get on him and continue to hound him and call him every name in the books. And so from that single remark, a great drastic shift in the labeling of Nikola Tesla came about. Science itself is unforgiving. There's many histories of scientists' persecution of other scientists with whom they disagreed. The system is very prone to either destroy, condemn, or bury any scientist who seriously disagrees with it to this day. Well documented. We could make another documentary movie on just that. However, here was a preeminent example of a disagreement with the current scientific control. And the scientific control was adamant that he get wiped out of the books and he get labeled a lunatic, and that's exactly what happened. He wound up with his name, Tesla, attached to a coil, and one unit of measurement named after his name. And as far as the scientist was concerned, that was enough. He didn't deserve anything else, most of them. So the scientific community rejected him. After Morgan turned his back, the financial community rejected him. Here was a loner then again, absolute loner. What was he to do? Exactly what he did, retire to his hotel room and feed the pigeons and think grand dreams. Live on a small pittance which kept life and limb together from his native Yugoslavia. And once a year have a press conference where he spoke of all the grand things that he thought of and he wished to have happened. But at least overtly, as far as we know overtly, never again was Nikola Tesla to ever have a chance to attempt any of the great things that always surged through his restless mind. I guess in summary of all of this, what does Tesla represent to the future, particularly benevolently? Let's forget the weapons. What can come from Tesla's work that's been yet unrealized that can benefit humankind, everybody on the face of this earth? There are some very positive benefits that loom. The greatest thing that Nikola Tesla ever did was to continue to point out that the present electromagnetics model is seriously flawed, and that electromagnetics is much more unlimited. Think for a moment of the service that the limited electromagnetics we have has been put to. Think of all the electronics, the communication industry, the power systems. It's changed the life of every person on the face of the earth. Consider for just a moment what an extension to what you can do can add to the benefit of everybody, everywhere, for all time. And I think when one ponders and considers that implication, then the full importance and the full...
Eric von Däniken's hypothesis will have an increasing effect on society, science, literature, and art. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence is a concern that affects all of humanity.
For me, it's like souvenirs of the past. Some of our human forefathers had contact with extraterrestrials. They were here, they visited us, they were in contact. Something happened in the deep past, and it will happen again in the future.
The author of the sensational international bestseller and the most compelling non-fiction publication of all time is back in London for the first time in 25 years to celebrate Chariots of the Gods' 50th anniversary. Eric von Däniken Legacy Night. In this 2-hour special, you are invited to share with Eric his most influential discoveries and revelations. Learn about his incredible life journey as an author and researcher. Meet the team behind the highly anticipated Chariots of the Gods 360-degree entertainment franchise. Eric Von Däniken Legacy Night, live streamed from the Princess Anne Theatre, Paved, 195, Piccadilly, London, October 15th, 2016. For more information and to purchase tickets, please visit zoharstargate.com.
Other financier who were in a great struggle with each other. It affected the stock market, it created inflation and everything. Plus, Tesla had done a very strange thing. As a gambler, he knew that Morgan would never give him his $150,000 that he needed to do the installation that he really wanted to do, which was going to cost more than that by some amount. So he had designed a smaller installation of 2 transmitters when he briefed Morgan, and he briefed him only on the communications aspect of it. Tesla had foreseen, as many people had at that time, but he had clearly foreseen the broadcast industry sending pictures and sound and music and so forth and information through the air. So Morgan financed the $150,000 based on communications only. Morgan knew of Marconi's work and some others who were racing to try to be the first wireless, as they called it in those days. Morgan was, he didn't care about all the finesse and so forth. He was strictly a financier. He was strictly interested in making money. And he knew this new area was going to go and going to make money, a lot of money, for whoever got there first. And in his opinion, Tesla had the best chance to get there first. So that's why he backed Tesla. Tesla, however, was even more interested in doing a worldwide energy system to provide energy that would be very cheap for everybody in the world, anywhere on the earth. And so the actual installation that he started building was this giant installation so well known to the Tesla fans and people who read of Tesla. In the struggle between Morgan and his counterpart almost bought Morgan's railroad company right out from under him. He bought, in fact, control of the voting shares of the preferred stock, but not of the common stock. And Morgan issued orders from Europe to buy Inventor, who was, in fact, essentially saying, I'm going to usurp your science. They would interpret it that way. Not all people were detractors, but many were. He also was not a great theoretician. He didn't fill up books with great theories and full of mathematics. And so he just didn't practice the game as it was being practiced. He was ostracized, I think, primarily because of his difference and because of his radical statements and because of his pronouncements of great systems. They didn't have the foggiest notion of what he was talking about. He had one other unfortunate incident which today we would laugh at, but was very serious at the time. I think it was 1901. I'd have to check my records. He picked up radio signals from space. You know, we know today, of course, that planets radiate RF noise and so forth. But when he announced this, it just caused a sensation, and all the scientists said immediately, what a kook, what a idiot. So an unfortunate reaction occurred in the scientific community that he had to be an utter kook because everybody knew that there were no signals from space. And that was an unfortunate timing and contributed to his demise.
Nikola Tesla also had an ego.
Very big.
And there's some argument for the fact that his ego, or his vision of self, may have undone him as well. Could you address that at all?
Yes, that's quite true. He was arrogant. He knew in his mind what he had done and what he could do. He had done the experiments, for example, in his few months at Colorado Springs, which proved that he was on the right path, and he was hastening back to New York to get the funding from Morgan and set up his Wardenclyffe and get on with doing the wireless, but also the other energy at the same time. He was going to do it all in one stroke. And when this panic came along and supplies went up and finally he made the final fatal mistake, he briefed Morgan in desperation that all the stock that could be bought at any cost. In one day, the stock made astronomical jumps. The whole stock market went crazy. We don't have anything like that in our time. inflation became suddenly rampant. Parts and electrical things went up 3 times, for example. And suddenly everybody furnishing parts, there was a panic because of the money shortage and everything, and the stock, we would today call it a crash in other stocks. So what happened is they began demanding all their money up front to the very beginning.
Are you saying that Tesla was forgotten after Wardenclyffe, that it was Wardenclyffe that ruined his reputation?
Well, it was a combination of events. There were many people who resented Tesla, particularly among the academic community. Number one, they didn't understand at all how he worked. He didn't have the academic credentials, what they regarded the high academic credentials they had. He, of course, had academic credentials. He certainly had been very vocal that the common electromagnetic theory, which he usually referred to as the Hertz theory and the Hertz waves, since Hertz, proved the Maxwell predicted wave. Tesla was adamant that there were no transverse Maxwell-Hertz waves in the ether, and that he, Tesla, was not using that kind of theory at all. That theory was very limited and did not apply to what he was doing. In other words, what he was saying to the entire scientific mind of the day was that what you're doing, gentlemen, is erroneous. Not only that, I'm proving you're in error. But because he had become a household word, when you do, you become a single name, Tesla, not Nikola Tesla, you see. And because of this kind of effect, he had become essentially the great wizard. He had given us the AC power system and everything, and there was a great deal of resentment for what they regarded as an upstart in that, what he was really about, because he thought Morgan would appreciate that. He simply did not understand a financier who's not interested in all of that, but what is it going to do to make me money? There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying that's the way Morgan approached it. At that point, Morgan also knew that Marconi was closing in on it and very close to transmitting wireless across the ocean, the Atlantic. So Morgan knew at that point, briefed on what yet had to be done and how much money Tesla needed and all that, he knew the game was lost from a communication viewpoint, that Marconi was going to be first. So at that point, Morgan, in his own mind, wrote it off as a bad investment gone sour. And one thing he did not do was throw good money after bad. A perfectly sound business decision today, we would say. So he simply wrote the project off. Tesla could never understand for some months thereafter what had happened, why he couldn't get the extra money. People began to quit work because he couldn't pay them. The suppliers wouldn't send him his supplies because he couldn't pay them up front. And the whole thing began to sort of grind to a halt. He did get the installation in operation, but he never succeeded at what he was doing. And by that time, Morgan was never going to finance him again. A combination of events then occurred within a few years of that to where suddenly things began to shift. The jealousy of the scientific community began to suggest that he was, after all, just a kook. Everybody knew that thing on Wardenclyffe was foolish. And so he became almost a non-person in the space of a very few years. Older man living in a hotel room, feeding the pigeons. With all his idiosyncrasies, he really did have idiosyncrasies. He had a morbid fear of germs. He would use something like 17 white napkins for a meal that he would have and meticulously lay one aside once he made the first wipe with it to wipe his hands or whatever. Well, my name is Tom Bearden. I'm a retired lieutenant colonel, presently also rather suddenly retired from aerospace with the aerospace step down widespread throughout the country. I've been doing research for many years into several areas, one on some of the work of Nikola Tesla, one on the area of trying to produce both a theory and some practical results for over-unity electrical machines, a small amount of work in anti-gravity, and in some medical applications, primarily in a new kind of electromagnetics. I once said Tesla was a dichotomy. Certainly, Tesla had certain idiosyncrasies which have been played up, usually any creative genius does. If you accept those and don't dwell on those, Tesla was a magnificent genius, in my opinion. I think he was so far ahead of his time in what he could do and what he understood, not necessarily in the language and the phraseology we use today, but in his own language and his own phraseology. I think he was well ahead of the times, 100 years ahead of his times, and maybe in this conversation we'll even go into that.
If Nikola Tesla, is what you said he is, why is he so relatively unknown to the general public?
Through a whole series of events. Tesla in his life story admitted one time he had been a gambler, and then he quit because he was a compulsive gambler. The last great gamble that Tesla took, he lost. And that, of course, was his great installation on Long Island, Wardenclyffe. He had, at that time, put everything he had into, you might say, one kettle. It was funded by Morgan. There was some struggle between Morgan and another